Hello everyone. Tonight we are traveling back to a time when the fate of the ancient world seemed to hang by a thread. Picture this. Rome, that tough little republic with more stubbornness than sense, was gasping for breath after nearly 2 decades of being stomped on by Hannibal, the man who somehow thought elephants were an appropriate form of transportation across the Alps. Let's be honest, most of us can't even manage moving a couch up 3 flights of stairs without regretting every life choice. Rome was bruised, battered, and depending on who you asked, just one battle away from complete collapse. The senators paced nervously in their togas, the farmers were tired of turning plowshares into spears, and the city itself was constantly haunted by rumors that Hannibal might be marching through their gates at any moment. For years, Rome had lived under the long shadow of this one Carthaginian general. Every parent could scare their kids into finishing dinner with just 3 words: Hannibal is coming. That's ancient history's version of the boogeyman. And yet, even in their darkest hour, the Romans were, how to put this politely, stubborn as a mule at a water trough. They weren't going to fold. They weren't going to surrender. The idea of giving up to Carthage was as unthinkable to them as unthinkable as someone not watching this video all the way to the end. And yes, that's my not-so-subtle hint for you to stick around. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Seriously, don't hit that button out of pity, because I can promise you this: unlike Hannibal's elephants, my storytelling is not about to trample your evening. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I'm curious if you're listening to this in the morning, at lunch, or my personal favorite, lying in bed with the lights off, pretending tomorrow's responsibilities don't exist. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. Rome's story at this moment was one of exhaustion. The Second Punic War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and while Rome had survived Hannibal's crushing victories at places like Cannae, those memories lingered like old scars. The Senate's coffers were strained, farms lay abandoned, and soldiers had been drafted so often that some families joked that military service was Rome's longest-running family tradition. Joked, of course, in the kind of dark way you laugh when you don't actually want to cry. Still, the Romans had their own superpower: resilience. Unlike other states that collapsed after one bad war, Rome seemed to thrive on disaster. Every defeat only seemed to make them angrier, more determined. Like someone who loses at a video game and immediately says, "One more round, I'll get it this time." Hannibal had thrown everything at them, and Rome kept coming back for more. Meanwhile, on the Carthaginian side, Hannibal's reputation had reached legendary status. He had embarrassed Rome in battle after battle, showing tactical brilliance that modern generals still study today. His men, though weary, were fiercely loyal, bound to him not just by command, but by shared survival in the harshest conditions. Some historians argue that Hannibal's very presence in Italy was his greatest weapon. It was less about the number of men he commanded and more about the fear he inspired. But historians still debate whether Rome truly teetered on the brink of destruction, or whether its stubborn institutions made its collapse impossible. In those years, children in Rome grew up knowing only war. Entire generations had never seen true peace. Markets opened with fewer goods, weddings took place without young men to attend, and temples were filled with prayers that the gods seemed a little too slow to answer. One odd detail often overlooked is that some Romans believed wearing certain charms, like knotted cords or bronze amulets, could ward off Hannibal's arrival, as if a small trinket could protect against an army. It probably worked just as well as putting garlic on your door to stop vampires. And yet, Rome's survival wasn't purely luck. It was grit. It was politics. It was, perhaps most importantly, the emergence of new leaders willing to gamble everything. Because as the war dragged on, one thing became clear: if Rome was to rise again, it needed fresh blood. A commander unshackled by the mistakes of the past. The Republic was running out of time, out of men, and out of patience. The stage was set, not just for another battle, but for a final reckoning between 2 titans: Rome, desperate to reclaim its honor, and Hannibal, determined to finish what he had begun. And somewhere in that mix, in the ruins of fear and hope, a new name was about to rise, one that would stand alongside Hannibal for all eternity. But that part of the story, well, that's for the next chapter. The name that began to circulate in whispers through the streets of Rome was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Too many, He was just another patrician, another general among the countless who had tried and failed to bring Hannibal to heel. But to others, especially the soldiers who served under him, Scipio was something different. He carried himself with an odd blend of confidence and charm. The kind of leader who could both inspire courage and crack a joke at his own expense. Think of him as the rare boss who both demands overtime and somehow makes you want to show up anyway. Scipio had already tasted battle, and not the pleasant kind where you stroll home afterward. He had fought at Cannae, that nightmare of a battlefield where Rome had lost tens of thousands in a single day. Most men came out of that horror scarred, traumatized, or broken. Scipio came out determined. He wasn't reckless, but he seemed to carry a quiet belief that Rome could, in fact, win this war not by repeating the same mistakes, but by thinking differently. That kind of thinking was almost as shocking to Rome as Hannibal's elephants. Rome, meanwhile, was desperate enough to gamble. Its old commanders had been chewed up by Hannibal's cleverness, so why not try someone younger? Of course, it wasn't all unanimous applause. Some senators muttered that Scipio was too inexperienced, too brash, and let's be honest, too charismatic for comfort. Rome's political elite had a way of treating charisma like it was a dangerous illness, useful in battle, but deadly in the Senate. Still, Scipio got his chance. His first move wasn't to chase Hannibal endlessly across Italy, which had been Rome's favorite pastime for years. Instead, he shifted the board entirely. He believed the real way to defeat Hannibal was to attack Carthage itself, to force Hannibal to abandon his playground in Italy and rush home to defend his city. It was a bold idea, and bold ideas usually got people either remembered as geniuses or remembered as embarrassing footnotes in history. Before making that leap, though, Scipio built his reputation in Spain. There, he pulled off victories that seemed impossible, often outmaneuvering Carthaginian forces with flair. Spain was rich in silver, grain, and manpower, so every success Scipio earned there also cut off supplies to Hannibal. Soldiers began to believe in him, whispering that this man might be Rome's answer to the Carthaginian menace. And you know you're doing something right when soldiers who normally complain about everything from food to sandals start actually admiring their general. Now, Spain wasn't all strategy and combat. Here's one odd little detail. Roman soldiers stationed there were said to have picked up strange local habits, like decorating their helmets with bright feathers, not for intimidation, but just because it looked nice. Imagine entire legions looking like oversized roosters marching into battle. Historians still debate whether this fashion choice had any practical purpose or whether the soldiers just wanted to stand out in the crowd. Nothing says "fear my might" like a helmet that doubles as carnival wear. Back in Rome, Scipio's reputation began to swell. Ordinary citizens pinned their hopes on him. Mothers told their sons to serve under him, and even some senators reluctantly admitted that maybe this young commander could succeed where others had failed. Rome, at this point, had learned the hard way that overconfidence was a recipe for disaster. But desperation, that could be harnessed. And while Scipio gained ground, Hannibal's situation in Italy began to shift. His brilliance hadn't dimmed, but the longer he stayed, the harder it became to maintain supplies and loyalty. Italian allies grew restless, some even switching back to Rome's side. Carthage itself was hesitant to keep sending support, preferring to fight a cautious war rather than commit fully to Hannibal's grand designs. Imagine being the greatest general alive, only to have your own government treat you like a side project. This contrast, Rome's desperate faith in Scipio and Carthage's wavering support for Hannibal, was slowly tilting the balance. Scipio, ever the strategist, understood that he didn't need to defeat Hannibal in Italy. He just needed to change the game. To pull Hannibal into a fight on ground Rome chose. Historians still debate whether Scipio's rise was inevitable or whether Rome just got lucky by rolling the dice on the right man at the right time. Some suggest that even without Scipio, Hannibal was already running out of options. Others argue that without him, Rome might never have found the nerve to strike Carthage directly. But for the Romans living at that moment, the details didn't matter. What mattered was that they finally had hope, a new general, a fresh strategy, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to end the war on their terms. Of course, no one knew yet that all roads were leading to one fateful battlefield in North Africa. For now, Scipio was the man of the hour, a rising star in a sky that had been dark for far too long. And like all rising stars, the real question was whether he would shine brighter or burn out before the final act. By the time Scipio had carved out his reputation in Spain, the balance of the Second Punic War was already wobbling like a tipsy senator after too much wine at a banquet. Hannibal still lurked in Italy, undefeated in the field, but his position was less secure with every passing year. The Italian allies who once rushed to his side were now quietly slipping away, deciding that maybe betting against Rome wasn't the smartest long-term investment. Loyalty in wartime, after all, has a shelf life. Scipio saw this weakness and turned it into a weapon. He didn't just fight battles. He negotiated, persuaded, and outmaneuvered with words as much as with swords. Some historians argue that Scipio's gift for diplomacy was as important as his military genius. He wasn't above bribing an ally, flattering a rival, or cutting a deal that made Rome look magnanimous. In other words, he was a politician in armor, which, let's be honest, sounds far more effective than most politicians in togas. But diplomacy alone wasn't enough. Scipio knew that to shift the tide, Rome had to take the fight to Africa. Hannibal was too slippery to trap in Italy, but if Carthage itself was threatened, Hannibal would have no choice but to sail home. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risk. If Rome failed on African soil, Hannibal would remain in Italy indefinitely and Rome's citizens might decide their golden boy was actually just shiny fool's gold. Before invading Africa, Scipio did something brilliant. He studied Hannibal, not just his tactics, but his psychology. Scipio had survived Cannae, and he never forgot how Hannibal thought. He knew his opponent loved ambushes, favored flexibility, and always struck where least expected. So, instead of trying to out-Hannibal Hannibal, Scipio crafted a different style, disciplined, controlled, almost mathematical. Where Hannibal thrived in chaos, Scipio thrived in precision. There's a peculiar little story from this period. Scipio supposedly trained his troops with a level of discipline that bordered on obsession. He drilled them until their maneuvers were second nature, then drilled them some more. At one point, he allegedly made them practice night marches, just to test whether they could keep formation without torches. Imagine thousands of Romans stumbling around in the dark, like disgruntled sleep. The joke among soldiers was that Scipio was less of a general and more of a very stern dance instructor. Back in Carthage, the situation was growing dire. With Scipio threatening their homeland, the Carthaginians had to call their champion back. Hannibal, after years of frustrating Rome in Italy, was finally ordered to return to Africa. He left reluctantly, for he knew that his grand dream of dismantling Rome from within was over. Still, if he was going to fight the final act, he was going to make it memorable. When Hannibal arrived in Africa, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any Rome or Carthage had ever seen. Both men, Hannibal, the master of surprise, and Scipio, the master of preparation, were about to collide. It was like watching two chess players who had studied each other's games for years finally sit at the same table. The difference, of course, was that instead of pawns and rooks, they had war elephants and legions. There's a strange detail often overlooked. Hannibal, by this point, had been campaigning so long that his army was a patchwork quilt of different cultures. Libyans, Numidians, Carthaginians, and even some Italian veterans marched under his banner. It made for a colorful force, but also a complicated one. Historians still debate whether Hannibal could truly rely on such a mixed army. Some say his charisma bound them together. Others suggest that, deep down, he knew unity was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, Scipio wasn't just preparing soldiers, he was preparing Rome itself for the final gamble. He convinced allies, secured supplies, and even managed to sway Numidian cavalry to his side, a move that would later prove decisive. The Numidians, famous for their fast horsemen, had once been Hannibal's greatest asset. Now, they would ride for Rome. If betrayal were an Olympic sport, ancient North Africa would have brought home gold. Through it all, Scipio carried himself with remarkable calm. He didn't underestimate Hannibal, but he also didn't quake in fear at his name. Where others saw Hannibal as a mythical figure, Scipio saw a man brilliant, dangerous, but still mortal. That perspective, perhaps more than anything, allowed Rome to believe that this final showdown could end differently than all the others. Historians still debate whether Scipio's plan to draw Hannibal back to Africa was genius, or just luck that happened to work. Some argue that Carthage's political pressure would have forced Hannibal home anyway, no matter what Rome did. Others claim that without Scipio's audacity, Hannibal might have lingered in Italy until Rome itself collapsed from exhaustion. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the shadows of history. What is certain is this: by the time Hannibal's ships landed on African shores, the war had shifted from a long, grinding stalemate to a fast-approaching finale. The Mediterranean world held its breath. Two of the greatest generals history would ever know were now moving toward each other, step by step, like actors entering a stage for the last act of a tragedy. And as Rome and Carthage prepared for the confrontation to come, no one could say for sure which empire would survive the curtain's fall. The clash of giants was inevitable, but first came the smaller moves, the skirmishes, the testing of strength, the probing of weak spots. Scipio and Hannibal didn't immediately hurl themselves into a single, grand showdown. Instead, they circled one another like cautious predators, each waiting for the other to blink. When Scipio's legions landed in Africa, they didn't charge straight for Carthage. Instead, they seized key positions, fortified camps, and secured allies. His first great triumph was convincing the Numidian prince Massinissa to join Rome. This was no small feat. Massinissa had once been aligned with Carthage, but politics, personal ambition, and maybe a dash of opportunism persuaded him to switch sides. With his cavalry, Scipio gained the swift, mobile strike force that Rome had always lacked. It was like Rome suddenly upgrading from a stubborn ox cart to a sleek racehorse. Hannibal, meanwhile, was reorganizing what forces he could scrape together. After so many years abroad, his once mighty army was a shadow of its former self. He did his best to recruit and train fresh troops, including war elephants, the living tanks of antiquity. But anyone who's tried to train elephants knows they don't exactly come with an instruction manual. Some of them charged bravely, others panicked at the smell of blood, and a few just stood around looking confused. Rumor had it that Carthaginian handlers sometimes spiked the elephants' drinks with wine before battle, hoping the tipsy beasts would charge forward in a fit of chaotic rage. Historians still debate whether this was clever animal psychology or just ancient bad bartending. The first real test came at the Battle of the Great Plains in 203 BCE here. Scipio met a Carthaginian army not led by Hannibal, but by his brother, Hasdrubal Gisco, and the Numidian king Sif. The Romans crushed them. It wasn't even close. Scipio's discipline and the speed of Massinissa's cavalry carved through the Carthaginian lines like a knife through a very unfortunate cheese wheel. This victory forced Carthage to sue for peace at least temporarily. But here's where the story takes one of those strange twists history loves so much. Just as Rome and Carthage were negotiating terms, Hannibal returned. Carthage, suddenly reinvigorated by the arrival of its legendary commander, tore up the peace talks faster than a Roman tax collector spotting a loophole. The message was clear: with Hannibal back, Carthage would fight to the bitter end. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the irony. Rome had all but secured victory, only to see it slip away because Hannibal's name still carried the weight of legend. Imagine signing the paperwork to end a war, only to have your opponent's most famous general walk through the door and declare, "Actually, we're not done yet." If there was ever a moment when Scipio's patience was tested, this was it. While Hannibal was rallying troops, Scipio kept his army sharp. He was obsessed with preparation. Soldiers practiced maneuvers daily, and Scipio himself studied every detail of Hannibal's past battles. He knew elephants would be deployed, so he devised strategies to create lanes through which the beasts could pass harmlessly. He trained his men to resist panic, drilling them until their reactions were second nature. One Roman soldier joked that by the end of training, they could probably march in formation even if a tavern fight broke out around them. There's a curious little anecdote from this time. Scipio supposedly inspected not just weapons and armor, but also the soldiers' shoes. He knew long campaigns weren't lost to swords alone, but to blisters, fatigue, and bad morale. The Roman army may have been the first in history to realize that the path to victory could hinge on a well-made sandal. Historians, admittedly, are divided on whether this makes Scipio a brilliant commander or history's earliest fashion critic. As the months passed, it became clear that all roads led to a final confrontation. Hannibal could not allow Rome to strangle Carthage by attrition, and Scipio could not risk Hannibal gathering too much strength. The two men, bound by destiny and mutual respect, prepared to meet at a place called Zama. Historians still debate the exact location of Zama. Some say it was near modern-day Siliana in Tunisia, others place it further west. The uncertainty adds a kind of ghostly fog to the story, as if the earth itself refused to reveal where one of history's greatest duels was fought. What is certain is that both generals marched their armies there, knowing that this battle would decide not just the war but the fate of two empires. For Carthage, Zama was the last chance. For Rome, it was the gateway to supremacy. The world of the Mediterranean Greeks, Egyptians, Spaniards, and countless others watched with anxious eyes. The outcome would reshape trade, politics, and culture for centuries. And yet, in the camps on the eve of battle, soldiers weren't thinking about history. They were eating rations, polishing weapons, and nervously joking about how tomorrow they might be trampled by elephants. So the stage was set. To legends, one whose career had been defined by brilliant victories, the other who had rebuilt Rome's pride from the ashes, were about to write the final chapter of the Second Punic War. And as night fell over the plains of North Africa, the wind carried whispers of what was to come. Some said the gods themselves were watching. Others simply muttered prayers into their blankets. But no matter how they looked at it, everyone knew, tomorrow, the world would change. The morning of Zama dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that might have been perfect for a picnic, if not for the thousands of men sharpening swords and nervously muttering prayers. Hannibal's army assembled in the early light, its war elephants stamping the earth and trumpeting like heralds of doom. Carthaginian infantry lined up in disciplined ranks, mercenaries alongside citizens, all bound together by the knowledge that this was their last stand. Across the plain, Scipio's legions formed with methodical precision. Roman shields gleamed in the sun, their red tunics flashing like a tide of blood against the pale earth. Behind them, the Numidian cavalry under Massinissa shifted restlessly, eager to prove themselves. One soldier was overheard saying, "If the elephants don't crush us, maybe boredom will." Proving that battlefield humor hasn't changed much in 2,000 years, Hannibal had arranged his army in layers. Mercenaries in the front line, Carthaginian citizens behind them, and his veteran Corthos who had marched with him through Italy in the rear. His strategy was to wear down the Romans through waves of resistance. And then, of course, there were the elephants, about 80 of them, lumbering forward with armor strapped to their thick hides. Scipio, however, had anticipated this. He arranged his maniples, small Roman infantry units, in checkerboard formations with wide lanes between them. When the elephants charged, instead of smashing into a solid wall, they found themselves funneled into empty corridors. Roman soldiers stood ready with spears, javelins, and in some cases, loud horns to scare the beasts. One could almost imagine the elephants thinking, "Wait, this isn't what we signed up for." Some elephants did indeed break through, trampling soldiers and sowing chaos. Others panicked, turning back into their own lines and crushing Carthaginian troops. Ancient battlefields were often decided as much by psychology as by steel. And nothing tested a man's courage like an angry elephant suddenly deciding that today was not the day for heroics. Historians still debate whether Scipio's clever formation or the unpredictability of the animals was the decisive factor. But either way, the Roman lines held dot. Then came the clash of infantry. Hannibal's mercenaries hurled themselves at the Romans, fighting with ferocity born of pay and desperation. They managed to inflict damage, but when they began to falter, the Carthaginian citizen soldiers behind them hesitated to advance. In the chaos, Hannibal's plan began to fray. Imagine trying to orchestrate a perfect symphony while half your musicians are playing off-key and the trumpets are literally elephants. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the cavalry battle raged. Massinissa and his Numidians engaged the Carthaginian horsemen, while the Roman cavalry supported them. For a time, the fight was balance dust, clouds rising, horses neighing, riders clashing with spears and short swords. But slowly, the Carthaginian cavalry gave way. Massinissa's men pursued them off the field, disappearing in a whirl of hooves and dust. At this point, the Roman infantry faced Hannibal's veterans alone. This was the true test. Hannibal's veterans were not green recruits. They were the hardened survivors of countless campaigns. They had beaten Rome before, and they might do it again. The clash between Roman legions and these seasoned warriors was brutal, drawn out, and evenly matched. For hours, neither side could claim victory. Soldiers locked shields, thrust swords, and staggered under exhaustion. Somewhere in the chaos, a Roman legionary supposedly shouted, "I joined for the pay, not this," proving that even then, soldiers had doubts about their career choices. And then, at the critical moment, the cavalry returned. Massinissa and the Roman horsemen, having routed the Carthaginian cavalry, circled back onto the battlefield and struck Hannibal's veterans from behind. The effect was devastating. Trapped between Roman infantry and cavalry, the Carthaginian line buckled. Historians still debate whether Hannibal foresaw this possibility or simply had no choice but to gamble. What's clear is that even his brilliance could not save Carthage that day. His army was shattered, his elephants scattered or slain, and his veterans cut down in the dust. The Battle of Zama was over, and with it, the Second Punic War. Hannibal, the man who had terrified Rome for nearly 2 decades, was forced to retreat. Scipio emerged victorious, earning the name Africanus for his triumph. Rome had not only avenged its earlier humiliations, but had secured its dominance over the western Mediterranean. One odd detail survives from later retellings. Some sources claim that after the battle, Hannibal sent a messenger to Scipio to congratulate him personally, praising his skill and acknowledging his superiority. Whether this was fact or later Roman propaganda is uncertain, but the image of one great general saluting another lingers as a reminder of the strange respect warriors often share. Even in defeat, as dusk fell over the battlefield, the crows circled and the wind carried the smell of smoke and sweat. Rome had won, Carthage had lost, and history had turned a corner. What lay ahead for both cities was peace on paper, but in reality, only one had secured the future. The battlefield after Zama looked less like a place of glory and more like the aftermath of a badly planned festival trampled earth. Broken weapons scattered everywhere, and men wandering in shock. Scipio's legions stood victorious, but victory had not come cheaply. The Romans had lost thousands, though fewer than the Carthaginians, and their relief was tempered by exhaustion. One soldier, collapsing against his shield, reportedly muttered, "If this is winning, I'd hate to see losing." Hannibal, ever the pragmatist, withdrew with the remnants of his veteran army. He had lost the battle but preserved his own life, and perhaps in his mind, that meant Carthage still had a chance, though a very slim one. Still, as he rode back to Carthage, he must have known the truth. The city he had defended so brilliantly for nearly 2 decades could no longer resist Rome. Historians still debate whether he regretted returning home when his political enemies had once urged him to stay away. In Rome's camp, celebrations began. Though Romans were famously wary of boasting too early, Scipio received his men with dignity, praising their courage. Massinissa, the Numidian king, was practically glowing. He had switched sides at just the right moment, and now his cavalry had tipped the balance of history. Better late than never, one Roman officer supposedly joked, earning a glare from Massinissa's entourage. Carthage, meanwhile, braced for disaster. Messengers arrived ahead of Hannibal with grim news, and panic swept the city. Citizens crowded the streets, crying out, while the council gathered to debate surrender. Some voices insisted that Carthage could continue the fight with what forces remained. Others, more realistic, admitted that Hannibal had been their last hope. When he returned, still clad in dust and grief, Hannibal urged negotiation. For perhaps the first time, Carthage listened. Scipio, confident in his victory, dictated harsh terms. Carthage was to surrender its fleet, hand over its war elephants, pay an enormous indemnity, and cede territory. Rome, however, would allow Carthage to continue existing at least in name. The decision was practical. Total destruction could come later, when Rome was ready. For now, Rome wanted to cement its dominance. The negotiations were dramatic. Carthaginian envoys stood before Scipio in his command tent, weighed down by the knowledge that their city's independence was slipping away. Accounts describe them as weeping openly, though Roman historians may have exaggerated this detail for effect. What is certain is that Carthage had no choice but to accept. Hannibal himself, though bitter, supported surrender. He had fought too long to see Carthage destroyed entirely. There's an odd anecdote preserved by later writers. Supposedly, during the negotiations, a Roman soldier carelessly leaned on his spear, which snapped and clattered to the ground. The Carthaginian envoys flinched as if struck, thinking it a sign of sudden Roman aggression. The tent erupted in laughter when the soldier sheepishly picked up the broken shaft, mumbling apologies. Even in moments of history-changing gravity, clumsiness finds a way. The Treaty of Zama marked not only the end of the Second Punic War, but also the end of Carthage as a real rival. Rome had risen from its near collapse after Cannae to stand as the master of the western Mediterranean. Scipio's triumph secured his reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals, second only to perhaps Julius Caesar in later centuries. Hannibal, though defeated, became a legend in his own right, a figure that Roman children would whisper about for generations. The news reached Rome in waves of celebration. Bells rang, sacrifices were offered to the gods, and families who had feared another Carthaginian invasion finally breathed easily. In one report, a Roman senator quipped, "At last, we can plant vineyards without worrying they'll be trampled by elephants." Back in Carthage, the mood was far darker. The indemnities weighed heavily, and the loss of military power was humiliating. Yet, the city survived, its harbor still bustling with trade, its people still industrious. Hannibal, ever restless, soon took on a political role, attempting to reform the city's finances and governance. He cut corruption, reorganized taxes, and, in doing so, earned the hatred of Carthaginian elites. It seems even the greatest general couldn't escape local politics. Historians still debate whether Rome missed an opportunity by not destroying Carthage outright after Zama. Some argue that leaving it alive, even weakened, was a strategic miscalculation. Others point out that Rome preferred slow strangulation over sudden annihilation. Whatever the reasoning, the uneasy peace would last for decades though, as we know, not forever. As the dust settled on the battlefield and the ink dried on the treaty, one truth became clear. Rome was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for empire. The victory at Zama was not just the end of one war, it was the beginning of something far larger. The kind of story that would reshape the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Peace, as it turned out, was not nearly as peaceful as the word suggested. Rome, flushed with triumph after Zama, strutted like a rooster in a farmyard. Senators congratulated themselves on having saved the Republic, while veterans of the campaign paraded their scars as if they were the latest fashion accessory. Scipio himself returned to Rome with glory trailing behind him like an oversized toga, soon to be honored with the name Africanus. If you're thinking, wow, free branding, yes, it was exactly that. Rome loved to slap geographical nicknames on their heroes. In Carthage, however, the mood resembled the morning after a disastrous party. The city still stood, but without its fleet, elephants, or military pride. Hannibal, the man who had once been Carthage's savior, now became its reformer. He entered politics, determined to stabilize Carthage's fragile economy and pay off Rome's crushing indemnities. One of his first reforms was slashing the power of the corrupt aristocracy. That went about as well as you'd expect. Politicians everywhere disliked being told their personal piggy banks are suddenly public property. Here's the strange twist. Hannibal actually succeeded. Carthage's economy, once drowning, began to float again thanks to fairer taxes and reduced graft. Merchants cheered, common citizens smiled, and Rome raised an eyebrow. Historians still debate whether Hannibal's reforms were so effective that Rome became nervous Carthage might rise again. One Roman senator supposedly muttered, "If he wins peace as well as war, we're doomed." You could say Hannibal's retirement plan wasn't much appreciated in Rome. Meanwhile, Scipio enjoyed his celebrity status. He dined with senators, attended banquets, and posed for statues that captured him in a heroic stance, hair slightly better than reality, as always. But behind the cheers, envy brewed. Other Roman generals resented his fame. Rumors began to spread, whispers about whether Scipio was too fond of luxury, too lenient toward enemies, too good. Rome, like any city full of ambitious politicians, often turned on its brightest stars. Carthage, still licking its wounds, found itself under the constant watch of Roman envoys. Any attempt to strengthen its defenses was blocked. Even repairing walls required Rome's permission. Imagine living in a neighborhood where your rival not only beat you in a fight, but also had to sign off before you could fix your front gate. Carthaginians grumbled, but they dared not provoke another war. There's a quirky story from this era. Supposedly, Hannibal installed secret compartments in his house to hide visitors from Roman spies. Whether true or not, it paints a vivid picture of a man who had gone from commanding armies to dodging nosy neighbors with clipboards. And yes, one can only imagine him muttering, "Great, I crossed the Alps with elephants, but now I'm hiding behind curtains." Despite these humiliations, Carthage thrived economically. Grain, trade, and textiles flowed through its ports, and the indemnities were paid off faster than Rome had anticipated. Ironically, the city Rome had tried to cripple managed to stand up straighter. Scipio, hearing of this, is said to have shrugged. Rome had no immediate need to destroy Carthage further. Better to keep them as useful taxpayers than rubble. Yet, peace was fragile. Rome's expansion continued elsewhere, into Spain, into the Greek world, into any region that dared look wealthy and weak at the same time. Veterans of Zama found themselves shipped off to new campaigns, swapping African dust for Iberian hills. Hannibal, watching from Carthage, must have realized that Rome's hunger would not stop with one enemy. The Republic was like a man who had tasted his first victory feast and discovered he preferred banquets to bread. Historians still debate whether Hannibal ever truly accepted defeat. Some accounts say he dreamed of new campaigns, sketching strategies in the sand while speaking to no one in particular. Others suggest he became resigned, focusing only on Carthage's survival. What is certain is that he remained a figure of unease for Rome. His very existence was like a lingering thundercloud after a storm. Of course, there were lighter moments too. One Roman report claims Hannibal was spotted playing board games with children in Carthage, occasionally explaining military tactics using pebbles and sticks. If true, imagine the scene. The man who once terrified Rome reduced to losing games of knucklebones to a humbling fate, though perhaps a peaceful one, thought as the years passed. Scipio and Hannibal became almost like reflections of each other, two men who had defined an era. Now, living under the weight of their legacies, Scipio basked in Rome's glory. Hannibal labored to keep Carthage alive. The world had shifted, and though the war was over, its consequences spread like ripples across the Mediterranean. Rome's citizens slept easier. Carthage's citizens worked harder, and both cities knew one thing: the peace after Zama was not the end of their story. It was merely the intermission. The uneasy peace between Rome and Carthage soon began to take on the flavor of a cold stew, particularly edible, but not very satisfying. Hannibal, still a looming shadow in Roman imagination, grew weary of constant suspicion. Roman senators whispered about him like children telling ghost stories at night, except instead of, "He'll get you if you don't behave," it was, "He's plotting revenge if we don't keep him under watch." Eventually, Hannibal left Carthage, slipping away to offer his talents elsewhere, and in doing so turned himself into the world's most overqualified freelancer. He first found refuge in the court of Antiochus III, ruler of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus was a king who had ambition far larger than his actual ability to pull it off. Historians still debate whether Hannibal advised him with true conviction or whether Hannibal quietly thought, "This guy has the tactical sense of a potato." Either way, Antiochus took on Rome in the so-called Syrian War, and Hannibal's presence was more a headline than a game-changer. Rome, of course, came out on top. Surprise, surprise, here's the odd twist. Hannibal, the great Carthaginian, may have spent his later years designing naval innovations rather than commanding armies. One story claims he developed new ship designs with secret compartments for boarding troops. If true, he basically shifted from military genius to part-time boat engineer. Imagine the man who crossed the Alps with elephants, suddenly sketching blueprints like an ancient Da Vinci. You almost wonder if he charged consulting fees. Meanwhile, Scipio Africanus remained in Rome, but his popularity had started to sour. Enemies accused him of corruption, claiming he had taken bribes during his campaigns in the East. The very man once hailed as the savior of the Republic now found himself defending his honor in court. Rome, it seemed, loved nothing more than building heroes just to watch them trip over their own sandals. But fate had one more scene to stage. Hannibal, hunted by Roman envoys, fled from kingdom to kingdom, like a celebrity avoiding paparazzi. He went from Antiochus's court to Crete, then to Bithynia, each time narrowly escaping capture. In one particularly quirky tale, Hannibal supposedly tricked pursuers in Crete by filling sealed jars with lead and covering them with a thin layer of gold on top, making it appear as if he had hidden treasure. The locals, naturally greedy, left him alone, guarding the fake loot, while he quietly made his exit. If true, it was one of history's earliest decoy chest pranks. Back in Rome, Scipio's downfall accelerated. His brother and allies became embroiled in scandals, and the Senate, always hungry for a scapegoat, turned against the once invincible general. Scipio, rather than face humiliation, retired to his estate at There he lived in relative isolation, refusing to return to Rome even for his own trial. It was a lonely end for the man who had defeated Hannibal, almost as if the Republic itself had grown tired of heroes. Hannibal's end was more dramatic. Tracked relentlessly by Roman agents, he finally found himself cornered in Bithynia. Realizing capture was inevitable, he chose his own exit. According to tradition, he carried poison in a ring, a final insurance policy against Roman triumph. Taking the poison, he reportedly declared that Rome would never have the pleasure of parading him as a captive. Whether the exact words were ever spoken, or even if the ring truly existed, remains uncertain. Historians still debate the details, but the image endures. The great general choosing his fate, rather than submitting to his enemies. It's a somber scene, but let's lighten it for a moment. Imagine being the Roman envoys tasked with catching Hannibal, only to find your prize had slipped away by his own hand. That must have been the ancient equivalent of showing up late to a surprise party where the guest of honor already left. Not exactly a success story to brag about back home. So there it was, the two titans of Zama, both ending not with fanfare but with quiet departures. Hannibal's body lay in foreign soil, far from the city he had fought to defend, while Scipio's tomb bore the inscription that Rome should never forget his name, though ironically, he had requested not to be buried in Rome itself. In their twilight years, both men became reminders of how glory, once blazing, eventually cools to embers, and yet, their duel lived on. Romans retold Zama as proof of their destiny, while later generations spoke of Hannibal as the man who nearly broke the unbreakable republic. Their legacies became intertwined, each defined by the other's shadow. Rome and Carthage had moved on, one ascending toward empire, the other shackled under defeat, but the echoes of their rivalry lingered in every Senate debate, every treaty, every wary glance across the Mediterranean. The war was long over, but the memory of Zama was immortal. With Hannibal gone and Scipio retired in quiet bitterness, Rome and Carthage drifted into a strange, lopsided relationship like neighbors, where one side owns a mansion and the other a shack, held together by hope and plaster. Carthage technically lived, but only under Rome's watchful eye. The indemnities from the Second Punic War drained its wealth, yet Carthaginian merchants still bustled along the docks, filling warehouses with goods and filling Roman pockets with taxes. Here's the thing, Rome's suspicion never eased. Hannibal might have been gone, but his ghost haunted every senator's imagination. Every time Carthage rebuilt a bit of its prosperity, Rome muttered, "They're up to something." It was as if Carthage was that student in class who got caught cheating once, and now the teacher stared every time they picked up a pencil. But history is messy, and sometimes boring bureaucracy can be as dangerous as swords. Rome passed laws restricting Carthage from raising armies without permission. Carthage agreed. What else could it do? Still, the city thrived in trade, sending ships across the Mediterranean. Ironically, Carthage became wealthier than ever. But wealth without armies is like owning a shiny sword you're forbidden to unsheath. And then came Numidia. Oh yes, Carthage's unlucky neighbor. King Massinissa of Numidia, once Hannibal's ally and later Rome's favorite horseman, became the constant thorn. Backed by Roman approval, Massinissa nibbled at Carthaginian lands, like someone stealing food off another's plate. Each incursion provoked Carthage, but Rome always shrugged and said, "We told you no war without our permission." It was the ultimate setup. Carthage could neither defend itself nor complain without sounding rebellious. Here's a strange little detail. Some sources say Roman envoys visiting Carthage were shocked by the city's elegance, even under restrictions. They marveled at its lush gardens and temples, at how its people still seemed spirited despite humiliation. Imagine being Rome, suspicious and envious at the same time, like checking your rival's Instagram and muttering, "How dare they look so happy after losing?" Meanwhile, in Rome, a new generation of politicians sharpened their tongues. One of them, Cato the Elder, made it his personal mission to remind everyone that Carthage was dangerous. He famously ended every speech with the words, "Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed." And no, he didn't care if the speech was about farming, taxes, or a broken aqueduct. He still tacked it on like a dramatic signature. Historians still debate whether this was strategy or just sheer obsession. But either way, it worked. Carthage, trapped, eventually snapped. When Massinissa provoked them once more, Carthage broke Rome's rule and raised an army to defend its territory. They won a minor skirmish but lost the greater game. Rome pounced on the violation, claiming Carthage had broken the treaty. It was as if they had been waiting for this exact excuse because, well, they had. And here's where it gets almost absurd. When Carthaginian envoys tried to explain, Rome demanded the impossible. First, disarm completely, then surrender hostages, then even move their city inland, away from the sea. That was like telling Venice to relocate to the Alps. Carthage refused. Of course, pride may bend, but it doesn't vanish, so the stage was set for the Third Punic War. Small compared to the second, yes, but crueler in intent. This wasn't about balance of power anymore. It was about erasing an old nightmare once and for all. Let's pause for a light-hearted note though. Imagine being a Carthaginian citizen, trying to explain Rome's demands to your family. So, we have to give up our weapons, abandon the city, and move inland. But hey, on the bright side, we'll get some exercise walking there. Somehow, I don't think that made it into the official speeches. As the Roman legions marched once again toward Carthage, both sides knew this wasn't a war of strategy like Zama, was a war of finality. Rome had grown into an empire in spirit, and empires don't like reminders of their near-death experiences. Carthage had become that reminder, and therefore, Carthage had to go. And so, what had started with Hannibal's elephants in the Alps would end with flames on the African coast. The Third Punic War didn't roar into being the way the second had. It crept in like a slow storm, whispered into life by Rome's paranoia and Carthage's desperation. By the time the legions appeared outside Carthage's walls in 149 BCE, the city had already endured humiliation upon humiliation, disarmed, forced to surrender hostages, and stripped of dignity. But Carthage wasn't dead yet, and desperate cities often fight like cornered animals. Rome, of course, expected a quick victory. After all, Carthage had been weakened for decades, forbidden to wage real war. The Romans imagined they'd march in, knock down some walls, and declare victory but Carthage had something Rome underestimated: stubborn pride. The citizens melted down sacred statues to make weapons. Women cut their hair to braid bowstrings, and even children carried stones to the battlements. It was less of a military campaign and more of an all-out civic resistance. Here's an odd detail. Ancient accounts mention Carthaginian engineers rigging up makeshift catapults from household tools, as if the city turned into one giant medieval workshop. Historians still debate whether this was a little exaggerated propaganda, but the image of an old merchant turning his warehouse pulleys into war machines is too good not to picture. Rome responded the way Rome always did, by tightening the noose. A long siege began, with Roman soldiers cutting off food supplies, blockading the harbor, and waiting for starvation to do the work swords couldn't. Siege warfare isn't glamorous, it's a slow grind, the kind of war where rats become a delicacy and patience becomes deadlier than arrows. And yet, Carthage refused to yield. For nearly 3 years, the city held on, inflicting heavy casualties on its besiegers. At one point, Carthaginian sailors slipped out under cover of night, launching small boats to harass the Roman blockade. These weren't mighty fleets like they were ragtag, desperate sorties. But desperation has its own strange power. It's like watching someone fight with a broken broomstick, and still landing a few hits. Meanwhile, in Rome, politicians back home grew restless. The Senate wanted results, and public opinion demanded closure to Cato the Elder's endless refrain of Carthago delenda isti. Eventually, Rome sent Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, to take charge. He was young, ambitious, and hungry for glory. You could almost hear Hannibal's ghost muttering, "Not another Scipio." Scipio reorganized the siege with ruthless efficiency. He tightened discipline among the legions, repaired morale, and built siege towers to scale the walls. Day by day, Carthage's defenses crumbled. Fires broke out, famine spread, and still, the people clung on. Imagine the sound of hammers echoing through the night as blacksmiths forged weapons from temple bells. Imagine mothers teaching children to carry water through smoke-filled streets. It wasn't just a battle. It was the slow death of a civilization trying not to go quietly. Here's a lighter thought. Though Roman soldiers stuck in the endless siege likely complained just as much as modern soldiers do. Great, another night camped outside the walls, and my sandals are full of sand. Also, the wine's gone. War has always had its universal grievances. The final assault came in 146 BCE. Roman troops stormed the walls, pouring into the city street by street. The fighting turned brutal and chaotic, but Carthage refused to surrender until the very end. Some reports claim fires raged uncontrollably, filling the skies with smoke for days. Historians still debate whether the destruction was deliberate or simply the collateral madness of urban combat. Either way, the flames became symbolic. Carthage, once Rome's greatest rival, reduced to ashdot, and yet, within the ashes lingered whispers of resilience. Survivors were sold into slavery, the city razed, the land famously cursed, though that last bit may be a Roman exaggeration. The phrase "salt sown into the fields" is often repeated, but scholars argue it's likely a myth invented later to dramatize the fall. Still, as far as storytelling goes, it paints one heck of an image. Rome emerged triumphant, but triumph can be oddly hollow. Carthage was gone, yes, but Rome also lost something, an enemy that had once sharpened its steel and spirit. Without Hannibal's shadow, without Carthage's competition, Rome's ambition turned elsewhere, toward Greece, toward the east, toward becoming an empire that forgot what it felt like to fear. And if you're keeping track of our earlier jokes, this was the moment when Rome won the game but lost the rival team. No more elephants in the Alps, just the uneasy silence of being the last one standing. The Battle of Zama had ended Hannibal's dream, but the Third Punic War ended Carthage's existence. Rome had finally closed the chapter, though in doing so, it had also begun writing the first lines of its own imperial overreach. Rome's destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE didn't just end a war, it sent shockwaves across the ancient Mediterranean. The Romans had proven they were more than just powerful, they were merciless. But here's the twist. Carthage wasn't the only city reduced to rubble that year. On the other side of the Aegean, the Romans marched into Greece and leveled Corinth, a wealthy city-state that had dared to resist. Two civilizations, two cities, both burned in the same year. For historians, it's a symbolic turning point. 146 BCE marked the moment Rome stopped being a regional power and started striding toward empire. It wasn't enough to win wars anymore. Rome now defined the rules of the game. Let's pause here for a funny image. Imagine being a Roman senator in 146 BCE. So, how was your year? Oh, not bad. We wiped Carthage off the map and sacked Corinth. Same old, same old. It's the kind of nonchalant cruelty only an ascendant empire could carry off. But for everyday Romans, the victories brought more than bragging rights. Caravans of loot poured into the city, gold, art, slaves, and exotic luxuries that dazzled the population. Greek statues began appearing in Roman villas. Carthaginian silks found their way into Roman markets. And suddenly, the capital looked a little less rustic and a lot more cosmopolitan. Rome was becoming not just richer, but more Greek. Philosophy, art, and literature from Greece flooded in, reshaping Roman culture in ways no legion could. Of course, this cultural explosion came with growing pains. Old-fashioned Romans grumbled that their youth were becoming soft, seduced by Greek rhetoric and foreign luxuries. Cato the Elder, had he lived a few years longer, might have wagged his finger and said, "I warned you about Carthage, and now look, you're all quoting philosophers instead of sharpening swords." Still, for the ruling elite, the conquest of Greece and Carthage was a jackpot. Landowners expanded their estates with cheap slave labor. Generals paraded through Rome in glittering triumphs, and the Senate basked in the glory of being the supreme authority of the Mediterranean world. But beneath the pomp, cracks were already forming. Here's where the irony kicks in. By eliminating external enemies, Rome unintentionally created the conditions for internal conflict. No more Carthage to fear, no more Hannibal at the gates. Suddenly, Rome's fiercest battles began happening within Rome itself. Senators schemed for power, ambitious generals eyed each other's armies, and ordinary citizens found themselves squeezed between growing inequality and political infighting. It's almost like the Romans traded one kind of danger for another. Instead of elephants crossing the Alps, they now had rival politicians crossing the Senate floor with daggers hidden in their togas. And if that feels like foreshadowing, well, it is. But let's not get too far ahead. In the immediate aftermath of Carthage's fall, Rome stood taller than ever. The Mediterranean had effectively become a Roman lake, Mare Nostrum, or our sea, as they liked to call it. Trade flourished, military power expanded, and the Republic basked in its golden age of dominance. And yet, the ghost of Carthage lingered. Romans would speak of it for generations, not just as a warning, but as a point of pride. Children grew up hearing stories of Hannibal's elephants, of the long siege, of the day their ancestors salted the earth. Whether or not the salt story was true didn't matter. What mattered was the myth. and myths have a way of living longer than cities. The fall of Carthage also left a lesson that empires never forget. Fear can be a powerful motivator, but once fear disappears, ambition looks inward. The Republic had destroyed its greatest external threat. Now, it would turn on itself. If Carthage's story had been about resistance against overwhelming odds, Rome's story was shifting toward something darker, the dangers of unchecked power, of success that sowed its own seeds of downfall. It was no longer about survival. It was about greed, glory, and control. And in that sense, the end of Carthage wasn't just the end of a rival, it was the beginning of Rome's long march toward becoming something even more dangerous than Hannibal ever was. With Carthage gone and Corinth flattened, Rome now stood unchallenged, the heavyweight champion of the Mediterranean. But here's the funny thing about victory: it tends to make people restless. Without an external enemy like Hannibal to unify the Republic, Rome's senators and generals began looking sideways at one another, suspiciously sharpening their ambitions along with their swords. The Republic was changing. The countryside filled with massive estates called latifundia, owned by wealthy patricians who used thousands of slaves to farm vast lands. Ordinary Roman farmers, the backbone of the old Republic, found themselves squeezed out, drifting into the city in search of work. Suddenly, Rome wasn't a city of citizen farmers anymore, but a bustling metropolis crowded with unemployed masses. Picture thousands of grumpy Romans hanging around, waiting for bread and entertainment. Yes, the bread and circuses cliched wasn't born yet, but the Romans were already rehearsing it. Meanwhile, the Senate congratulated itself on running the world. Even though it was becoming clear that their grip was slipping, corruption spread, politicians bribed voters, and elections turned into elaborate games of favors. Historians still debate whether this decline was inevitable after Carthage's fall, or whether different leadership might have slowed the unraveling. Either way, the Republic's shiny new empire came with some very squeaky wheels. And then came the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. They were the poster children for reform, standing up for the poor farmers and demanding land redistribution. Noble cause, right? Except in Rome, noble causes had a tendency to end with clubs and daggers. Tiberius was beaten to death in the Forum in 133 BCE. His brother Gaius followed a decade later, hunted down by political enemies. Not exactly the kind of bedtime story ending you hoped for. Remind me to never run for Roman office. Their deaths signaled something bigger. Violence was now becoming a political tool. The Republic had crossed a line, and once that door was open, it wouldn't close easily. On the brighter side, or perhaps the order side, Roman culture was flourishing. Greek philosophy was still pouring in. Roman engineers were building aqueducts that defied logic, and markets buzzed with goods from Africa, Spain, Asia Minor, and beyond. Imagine walking through Rome's bustling forum. Spices from the east, wine from Greece, silks from Asia, and some confused trader trying to convince people that ostrich eggs make great soup bowls. The Romans, of course, were equal parts practical and superstitious. Alongside their military conquests, they picked up strange religious cults, foreign gods, and quirky rituals. One particularly odd trend was the cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess from Anatolia, whose priests were known for dramatic ceremonies and, well, some very extreme self-sacrifices. Romans might have been world conquerors, but they were never shy about borrowing unusual traditions from abroad. And as all these changes swirled together, political unrest, cultural imports, shifting social classes, the Republic began to feel less like the stable state that had defeated Hannibal, and more like a ship overloaded with cargo, rocking dangerously on open seas. Here's a little joke to lighten it up. Imagine explaining to a Roman farmer in 200 BCE, "Good news, we beat Carthage," and then, a few decades later, having to add, "Bad news, you lost your farm, the city is overcrowded, and senators are stabbing each other over land reform." That's the kind of victory only politicians could love. Still, the people of Rome had reasons to feel proud. Their armies marched farther than ever, their economy boomed, and their culture grew richer by the day. But beneath that pride lurked unease. You can't rule the Mediterranean without making enemies, and Rome was quietly breeding its most dangerous enemies from within. If the fall of Carthage had been Rome's proudest moment, what followed was the Republic's longest headache, and like all good headaches, it would take more than a strong drink of wine to cure it. By the time the dust settled from the Gracchi brothers' reforms and their rather messy endings, Rome was officially hooked on a dangerous new addiction. Powerful generals who acted less like loyal servants of the Republic and more like celebrities with private armies. You could almost call them the influencers of their day, except, instead of selling skincare routines, they were selling conquest and loyalty through plunder. The first big name in this new era was Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins. He climbed the ladder not through family connections but sheer determination, and maybe a dash of political cunning. His reforms to the Roman army were revolutionary. Instead of landowning citizens, he allowed the poor to enlist. Suddenly, the legions weren't just farmers defending Rome. They were professional soldiers who saw military service as a career. That sounds practical, right? Except it also meant soldiers now looked to their generals, not the Senate, for their rewards. Imagine working at a company where you're loyal to your boss but couldn't care less about corporate headquarters. That's basically Rome after Marius. His legions adored him, and his victories against Jugurtha in North Africa and invading Germanic tribes made him a hero. The problem? Rome was quickly becoming a place where heroes didn't like to share the spotlight. Q. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius's rival, whose career was basically one long grudge match. Sulla was ruthless, ambitious, and the kind of man who, when told he couldn't do something, would respond by marching on Rome itself. Yes, you heard that right, marching on Rome with his own legions, twice. The first time in 88 BCE shocked everyone. The second time, in 83 BCE, left the Senate trembling and Marius's supporters in chaos. Historians still debate whether Sulla truly believed he was restoring the Republic or just restoring his ego. Either way, he installed himself as dictator and published proscriptions, a fancy word for hit lists of enemies whose property could be seized. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering your name was on the list. That's one to ruin your breakfast. Oddly enough, Sulla eventually stepped down from his dictatorship, retiring to his villa to live a life of luxury. A dictator who resigns voluntarily, only in Rome. Although, knowing Sulla's personality, maybe even he realized that micromanaging senators was worse than fighting barbarians. Meanwhile, in the background, Roman society kept spinning in bizarre ways. Gladiatorial games were becoming bigger and bloodier spectacles, often sponsored by politicians to win public favor. Bread and circuses had gone from metaphor to reality, and while the Senate tried to pretend it still ruled, everyone could see the writing on the wall. The Republic's real power lay in the hands of men with armies. Here's a strange detail. While Rome was tearing itself apart politically, it was also importing flamingos. Yes, flamingos. The wealthy elite of the late Republic developed a taste for exotic animals, not just for feasting but also for showing off at dinner parties. Picture senators arguing over land reform while nibbling on roasted flamingo tongues. It's both grotesque and oddly impressive, but let's not get distracted by bird buffets. The key shift was clear. Rome's old system of shared power was cracking. Marius and Sulla's rivalry showed everyone that if you had an army, you didn't need the Senate's approval, you could simply take what you wanted. Here's a joke, to break the tension. If you think modern politics is brutal, just remember at least, today's politicians don't keep a list of enemies they can legally kill and then auction off their houses. Well, not officially. Rome had changed forever. By the time Sulla passed away in 78 BCE, the Republic was less a functioning government and more a high-stakes stage where ambitious men competed for fame, fortune, and legacies carved in marble. And looming just off stage were a few names that would soon become legendary: Pompey, Crassus, and a rising star named Julius Caesar. The Republic had survived Hannibal, Carthage, and even Sulla's dictatorship, but what was coming next would test whether Rome could survive itself. By the time Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar stepped into the spotlight, the Roman Republic was already running on fumes. The Senate liked to pretend it still held the reins, but in reality, it was like a nervous substitute teacher in a classroom full of overconfident students. The real power belonged to the generals who controlled armies, wealth, and most importantly, public opinion. Let's start with Pompey. Nicknamed Pompey the Great, he was the golden boy of Rome, sweeping through campaigns in the east, defeating pirates, and adding new territories like trophies on a shelf. The man had a fan club before fan clubs were even a thing. Then came Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose fortune made Elon Musk look frugal. Crassus was so rich, he once supposedly owned entire blocks of Rome and made extra money by sending his private firefighters to burning buildings. If the owners didn't sell to him on the spot, well, the fire brigade took their sweet time. Talk about ruthless real estate. And then there was Julius Caesar, young, ambitious, and dripping with charisma. Caesar was the kind of guy who could convince you to lend him money, follow him into battle, or laugh at his jokes even if they weren't funny. He built his career partly through charm and partly through sheer audacity. One time, pirates kidnapped him, and instead of begging for his life, he told them they weren't asking for enough ransom. He promised he would come back and crucify them once freed. Spoiler alert, he did. The three men formed what historians now call the First Triumvirate, fancy term meaning unofficial power club. Together, they bent the Republic to their will, trading favors, offices, and influenced like kids swapping lunch snacks. Of course, historians still debate whether they truly respected each other or simply tolerated the partnership. While sharpening their daggers behind the scenes, Caesar's biggest prize came in Gaul. His campaigns there were staggering, expanding Rome's territories all the way to the English Channel and beyond. His commentaries about the wars made him a celebrity author, painting himself as the hero. Imagine a general writing his own bestseller while still fighting the battlestalk about multitasking. Meanwhile, back in Rome, senators were gnashing their teeth. A successful, popular general with loyal legions. That was the Senate's worst nightmare. Pompey and Caesar's partnership, already shaky, cracked wide open when Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died. Without that family bond, their alliance unraveled into bitter rivalry. Crassus tried to balance things out, but made a disastrous attempt at glory in Parthia, where he was killed. A rumor says molten gold was poured down his throat as a mockery of his greed. But historians still debate whether that's true or just poetic revenge. Rome now teetered on the edge. The Senate demanded Caesar disband his army and return as a private citizen. Caesar, knowing that stepping into Rome without his troops would be political suicide, made a bold choice. In 49 BCE, he led his army across the Rubicon River, declaring, "The die is cast." Well, technically, he probably said it in Latin. But you get the idea. That moment was the point of no return. Civil war exploded, pitting Caesar against Pompey, once his friend, now his bitter enemy. It wasn't just a clash of two men, it was a clash of visions for Rome's future. And Rome itself seemed to sigh, as if realizing this was the start of something that couldn't be undone. Here's a joke to lighten the mood. Imagine being a Roman senator at that time, trying to plan your vacation. Should we go to Pompey's Rome or Caesar's Rome? Either way, we might lose our heads. As Pompey fled to Greece and Caesar pressed forward, the Republic was on life support. The Senate, instead of saving it, became little more than a chessboard for ambitious generals, and somewhere in the background, citizens whispered about whether the Republic could ever truly return or, if Rome was destined to crown a single man as ruler. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in history. The war between Caesar and Pompey was more than a struggle for power. It was the final act of the Roman Republic. Once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey scrambled to rally his supporters, moving east to gather troops. Caesar, swift and confident, marched through Italy almost unopposed, his reputation acting like a battering ram against resistance. Citizens cheered him. Senators quaked in fear. It was as if the Republic itself was holding its breath, waiting for the clash. That clash came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, backed by the Senate and commanding a massive force, believed victory was inevitable. He had the numbers, the resources, the prestige, but Caesar, ever the strategist, turned the tide with cunning maneuvers and the loyalty of his veteran legions. Against the odds, Pompey's army crumbled. It was the kind of upset that makes you wonder if underdogs really do get all the best storylines. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge. Instead, he found betrayal. Seeking favor with Caesar, Egyptian courtiers murdered Pompey on the shore before he could even set foot safely. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Whether those were genuine tears or political theater, historians still debate. But either way, the man who had once been Rome's greatest general had fallen not in battle, but at the hands of Schimmerus. Caesar lingered in Egypt, famously entangling himself with Cleopatra. Their alliance, personal and political, produced one of history's most iconic partnerships. Cleopatra sailed down the Nile with him, dazzling him with her charm and intelligence. While back in Rome, rumors swirled like wildfire. Even then, people loved gossip more than grain rations. But Caesar was not done reshaping the Republic. Returning to Rome, he initiated sweeping reforms, adjusting the calendar. Yes, we still use his version, reorganizing debts, expanding citizenship, and trying to stabilize a system that had been cracking for generations. Yet the more power he gathered, the more his enemies whispered the dreaded word, King. Rome, after all, despised monarchy. The idea that one man could hold supreme power made senators nervous, and nervous senators sharpened knives. In 44 BCE, on the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate chamber. Friends and foes alike surrounded him. What happened next was a whirlwind of daggers and betrayal. The conspirators struck, even men he trusted. Brutus. Most famously, Caesar fell beneath the statue of Pompey, his one-time ally and rival, as if Rome itself was mocking him with irony. The Republic thought it had saved itself from tyranny, but in truth, it had just guaranteed chaos. Civil war returned with a vengeance. Caesar's heir, Octavian, and his brilliant but volatile ally, Mark Antony, hunted down the assassins. Rome was once again soaked in rivalry, alliances, and betrayals. Antony fell under Cleopatra's spell, while Octavian maneuvered with cold precision. Eventually, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, who ended their lives in Alexandria. Their love story ended in tragedy, while Rome's destiny was reshaped forever. In 27 BCE, Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was gone, replaced by the Empire. It had not fallen with Caesar's death, but with the acceptance of Augustus' rule. What started with small cracks, the Senate squabbles, ambitious generals, broken alliances, had ended with a crown in all but name. Here's a light-hearted thought. The Senate had spent decades trying to avoid one-man rule, only to hand it neatly to Augustus. If irony could be taxed, Rome's treasury would never have run dry. And so, the Republic slipped quietly into history, leaving behind legends of senators, soldiers, generals, and dreamers who tried to shape it. Rome had traded its chaotic democracy for stability under an emperor. Whether that was salvation or surrender, historians still debate. Now, as we close the story, let's slow down. The flicker of torchlight fades in the mind's eye. The roar of the Forum quiets into a distant hum. Imagine the Tiber flowing gently under the Roman moon, its waters carrying whispers of the past. The marble statues of long-dead senators stand silently, their stone faces calm, as if reminding us that time smooths even the sharpest edges of conflict. The night grows softer, and the voices of history drift away like fading echoes. The clatter of shields, the chants of legions, the shouts of senators all dissolve into stillness. You are left with a deep sense of calm, as if standing in the ruins of an ancient city where only the stars remain eternal. So breathe deeply, let the tension go, and allow the story of Rome to rest with you. Tonight, history has been your lullaby, and tomorrow will wait patiently until you wake. Close your eyes, let the images fade, and drift gently into the quiet embrace of sleep.